Allison. I am the former web editor at Tricycle, and we're here, of course, today with author and meditation teacher Sharon Salzberg and Buddhist scholar and teacher Megan Mook. Megan is a teacher. She leads regular retreats and classes. You can find more information about her work on her website, which we'll drop into the chat. And most recently, actually, Megan just joined us on a tricycle pilgrimage, which she helped lead in Mongolia. Megan will also be helping to lead a tricycle pilgrimage in Ladakh in June and coming up in India in November, I think. So go to Tricycle's website to learn more about the tricycle pilgrimages and check out Megan's website to learn more about her retreats and her classes. She has one retreat in Costa Rica in March, actually, that you might want to check out. All right. And as for Sharon, as many of you probably know, Sharon hosts the Meta Hour podcast. She is also a co-host on Tricycle's Life as It Is podcast. And her most recent book is Real Life, which came out in April. And Tricycle is actually hosting a course with Sharon that's based on the book. You don't have to have read the book to enjoy the course, but you should read the book, and you can go to Sharon's website to learn more about her work and find the book. And for all of you here, we are actually doing giving a 25% off discount code on the Tricycle course, Real Life. So we'll drop that in the chat, but the discount code is Real Life 25. And you can go to Tricycle's website to learn more about this course and all of our other courses. So that's a lot of housekeeping. One more thing to mention before we begin. We are going to do a Q&A at the end of this. So if anything occurs to you as you're listening to the conversation, or if you have any questions that you'd like to pose to Sharon or Megan, please drop your question in the Q&A and we'll do our best to get to it. So without further ado, we have Sharon and Megan, and we're going to kick things off with a short meditation from Megan. So thank you all for being here, and Megan, it's all yours.
Hi, and thank you. I feel excited because I didn't know that we were going to kick things off with a meditation. As much as I love talking, I like meditating more. So this won't be long, but go ahead and close your eyes, or if you can, at the very least, disengage from the screen. And just take a moment to land. Start to come into your body. To your breath. See if you can use the felt physical sensations of breathing as a way to open and expand. And if you like, you can start to direct your breath in and out of your heart center. And so I mean the energetic heart in the center of the chest. You can go so far as to imagine that you have two nostrils there. So you're literally breathing in and out of the heart. In case you didn't know, this is how we access our full potential. It's through the heart. So as you breathe in and out of the heart, let yourself become more sensitive, more attuned to feeling. And see if you can touch or sense how much you want to be happy. How much you, like everyone else, yearns for love. And connection. And how deep down we all know that that's where happiness comes from. Just taking a couple more moments to feel that skirt close to it, our shared desire for happiness and love, connection. And maybe feeling some gratitude at how amazing it is that this is our path to potential. Love and happiness and connection. It's right there. So with that in mind, with that in your heart, in your body, take a nice deep breath in, full of feeling. And a long, easy breath out. Close your eyes if they weren't totally closed, just for a second. And then in a moment, when we open them, before you look back at the screen, take just a few beats to look around the space that you're in. You can do that now and just take it in. As you feel ready, you can start to make your way, your awareness back to the screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. What a wonderful way to start this conversation. Thank you. So, again, I think everyone knows that we're here to talk about reaching our full potential. And I thought we would begin with something that really struck me when I was rereading Real Life, Sharon's most recent book. So Sharon, in the first few lines of Real Life, you write, there are times when we feel like we're merely bystanders to our own lives. There are times when we feel mired in habit, withdrawn and small. Can you talk about why it's so common that we feel like bystanders in our own lives? You know, how does this happen and why?
Well, why questions are kind of difficult because, for one thing, is one of my teachers, this man named Manindra, would always say, a why question brings in a belief system. I can talk about family structure, I could talk about culture, I could talk about religious upbringing, I could talk about past lives, I could talk about many things, so I'm not so much in the habit of really why, but I'm more in the habit of like, what is this? What is this experience? What's my experience of it? Does it seem common? and especially when it's painful, constricting, limiting, how do I work out of it? Is there a path? So I'm a big path person, uh, and I believe in path, and not only in meditative life, but I believe in craftsmanship, or learning, and I love learning, and so um, I think of it more in those terms. So I wrote the book, since you were talking about the book, um, in lockdown, basically because of the pandemic. Unlike Megan, who is doing all these dazzling trips all around the world, I have not been on an airplane since March 3rd, 2020. And it was a very different life for me in that period, and somewhat continuing. And so, um, while not a practicing Jew, an observant Jew at the point, I was raised Jewish. And the one of the things that's really stuck is the Passover ceremony and gathering, and partly because of family and the sense of gathering and love and so on. And as an adult, I've come to see Passover as a um, expression of all people at all times seeking freedom. And I saw a show in the very beginning of the pandemic on YouTube. It's still up there. I love it. Called Saturday Night Seder. And it reminded me that the word Egypt, taking this totally out of geopolitics, the word Egypt means a narrow place, a confined place, feeling trapped. And that's the journey from narrowness to freedom. And so that's the arc of the book. And that beginning, was very important because that's how we often feel.
Thank you. Yeah, I think something that, as you said, the arc of the book is kind of from disconnection to connection, and being closed to being open. I One thing that kind of immediately came to mind, and you tell a really beautiful story in the book, actually, about a mother who lost her son to gun violence, was we can be cut off from each other, but also you describe how this woman was cut off from her own emotions. So she felt disconnected from herself. Sharon, do you think you could talk a little bit about how that seems like a bad starting place, to be cut off from your emotions. How do you kind of overcome that? It seems like a pretty necessary first step.
Well, I don't know that it's a bad starting place. I think many of the especially the adaptations we began in childhood were extremely sensible at the time, and even adulthood. Closing off, leaving your body, would be a very classic one. Not feeling, not allowing yourself to feel, getting this. You wouldn't do this so much as a child, maybe, but certainly as an adult, getting really fast, really busy. Like superseding, jumping over the emotions. I mean, those make a lot of sense in situations where we don't sense many options. It's survival, and it's sensible, and it's good. If it's something you picked up as a child, it's an interesting question at the age of 45. Maybe there are other options, or 22, or for in my case, 18, when I went to India to learn meditation. Are there other options? And usually there are, as we mature, or as the tremendous traumatic incident is a little bit behind us, or, a great deal behind us. We do have other options. And that's where the sense of a path comes in, and so I just want to honor that tendency we might have. There are many circumstances in one's life where so-called leaving your body or going numb is a really smart thing, but you may not want it as a lifetime habit, and you don't want it necessarily as your go-to immediate place, every time. And so the most important thing, I think, is having a sense of possibility. Like, at least let me explore. It's not certainty by any means, but let me explore. And sometimes it's a sense of community. You don't have to feel so alone in that journey, which is not always, as you say, it's not always an easy journey. So sometimes it's establishing the community consciousness. Sometimes it's just experimenting. And usually that demands a certain context, like to allow oneself to feel some very difficult feelings is very important as you describe it. And yet, it's like sometimes it's baby steps. That's okay. You don't have to have a feeling like I've got to rip it all off at once, something like that.
Thank you. Yeah. Megan, do you have anything you'd like to follow up with there? That's a lot to. Oh, I think you might be muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. That was interesting Sharon, what you led with talking about the difficulty of why questions. I feel the same way, especially if we're trying to universalize something. But Allison, when you talked about, feeling like a bystander in our life, I went and thought about like, I guess why, maybe I feel self-conscious about saying it, but I did think about why I feel like a bystander. And to kind of get at it, I don't know, this image or this experience that I've had several, of course, many times, and feeling of looking at the night sky is what came to mind. And just those nights when it's super clear and you can see what seems like zillions and zillions of stars. And that feeling of being able to sense like vastness and possibility, like you were saying, Sharon, but also this sort of like underside of that, where in addition to the vastness, there's this feeling of smallness isn't quite the right word, but maybe like the vastness puts all of our little worries and narratives into perspective. And for some reason, under a night sky, that feels very like whole and encompassing and comforting to me. But I think out in like regular life, that doesn't feel so safe. And so I think what I notice in myself is this constant kind of like pulling back, both from like the vastness and the potential, but also from the like putting my narrowness into perspective. Yeah, so I feel like there's this constant, at least in my mind, and maybe it's universal, this sort of like shutting down and pulling back. And I think that's what creates the experience of feeling like a bystander.
Yeah, that's very well put. And when Sharon mentioned possibility and hearing and you talking in it, the thought that like you could feel safe with this possibility, I think that's really important, because that definitely seems to be, I don't know, at least for me, that's like my immediate response was like, how do I know it's going to be okay? So
Can I add something?
please.
I'm not really sure it's possible to feel safe.
Okay.
But I think it's possible to feel free. And I think that it's our desire for safety that blocks us from the freedom. But I do think there's this like leap that we have to make, which is really scary, because we have to leap not knowing whether we're going to be safe, but maybe like trusting or being willing to experiment that we'll be free in the leap in the fall.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess as Sharon touched upon as well, like having community can kind of help support us. So I think it might be helpful, actually, Sharon. In the book, you talk a lot about contraction versus expansion. Would you mind kind of explaining how those two concepts are really like an important part of the book and how they relate to this conversation?
Yeah, thank you. It's really the framework of the book. It's not even so much contraction versus expansion uh, always, but it's more like, first of all, that sense of constriction, narrowness is really a sense of feeling trapped. It's not about being focused, being purposeful, being specific, which sometimes gets confusing. You can be very one-pointed, very centered, very determined on a course of action, but not have that feeling of being trapped. It's also not about feeling certain things, like anger, greed, jealousy, fear. It's more about being overwhelmed by certain feelings. And that's an important distinction because we can be so judgmental about what we're feeling. And I think we have to, I don't have any of my pandemic mugs in here right now, but when I was teaching so very much online during the kind of height of the pandemic, people would take to sending me mugs and cups that had printed on them sayings that apparently I was using all the time. So it includes things like "some things just hurt." I have that mug, and I've got "we feel what we feel." I've got that mug. We have to allow ourselves the dignity of every feeling, and yet feelings are consequential. Thoughts are consequential. When we get lost in them, as one of my teachers, Sonny Rinpoche, Tibetan teacher, would say, it's not the thought that's the problem, it's the glue. So the consequence of being lost in, immersed and overwhelmed by certain patterns is that our lives get very small. We don't have a sense of options. We're kind of guided by the fear, determined our actions, our choices are determined by the fear, rather than, as Megan was saying, being able to observe it, being, kind of observant of it. And that's the life of a lot of suffering. It's a lot of lost potential, basically. And in contrast to that is a life of some expansiveness. It's loving kindness, compassion, listening to one another, feeling a sense of connection, feeling a sense of belonging in this world, which is not that common either. Wisdom, insight, perspective on things. It all opens us. If you look at the work of Barbara Fredrickson, who's a researcher in North Carolina, who studies positive states, she studies loving kindness, generosity, gratitude, things like that. And she's got a theory. It's called the Fredrickson broaden and build theory. That when we strengthen these states, our perspective opens. It broadens. The world gets bigger. And we build in a resource. So we don't feel so exhausted all the time and trying to meet adversity or whatever. So I rely on her work quite a lot, broaden and build. What's fascinating to me, and which I really try to emphasize both in the book and in the course, the upcoming course, is that disliking the contracted states and feeling ashamed of them is not the point. It's never onward leading. So we need a whole other approach to that contraction in order for it to turn into expansion, which it will. So it's more like the holding environment. It's the relationship to these states. And that's what's tricky for us. And it's also exciting for us that it's a very different approach.
I love Barbara Fredrickson's work, and yeah, I feel like the broaden and build theory like sums up the way I've gone about my path, which is just trying to gather and cultivate as much love and openness and compassion as possible, and through that becoming more and more buoyed and like capable of dealing with the stuff that's hard to hold. I want a mug that said, what is exactly that you said? Like, find the dignity in the feelings?
Yes, I don't have that mug. Not that anyone should send it to me. It's all right. But that was my add-on to we feel what we feel. And some things just hurt. Because I really believe that too. It's not very trendy maybe, but I don't think it's just our attitude or our approach to things. What we don't need is extra suffering. That's very true. But I've also seen so many people, like the woman who lost a child with gun violence, and many people who endured tragedy of some kind, to feel like I shouldn't have a reaction, which is ludicrous,
Yeah, what it made me think of when you said the dignity and the feeling, which is just so beautiful to me. It made me think of what you were saying earlier about whatever our coping mechanisms or adaptive strategies, like such as disassociating or checking out from the body, that within those there's like a corresponding possibility
Mhm.
So the corresponding possibility of checking out or disassociating is like this really vast ability to be present and hold everything. And like anger has its own corresponding possibility and all this. So yeah, that's really beautiful. Thank you for
That
voicing that.
is extremely tantric of you, which is kind of,
Thank
as I
you.
understand it, sort of the basis of some of that approach, some of that teaching is that within states that may be contracting, let's say, for, continue that model, there is a
Yeah,
jewel.
yeah,
And
exactly.
even
Yeah.
within, Theravada teaching, with mindfulness teaching, there's a belief there's a jewel, as you say, within anger, which maybe you could describe that some for us, because I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean they say the jewel within anger, which is another extremely beautiful turn of phrase that I would like a mug of, the jewel within anger, is clarity. Um, in the tantric teachings, they might use they do use the term mirror like wisdom, but it's the ability to perfectly reflect what's going on without adding anything to it. And anger is always adding an overlay of, I'm right or you're wrong, or there's this kind of bluntness that can come with it as well.
In the Theravadan teachings, as it's different, I think, in the Tibetan teachings, but just a different formulation. There are these personality types that are spoken about,
Oh, tell me.
and the angry type. It's not like if you're an angry type, you wouldn't necessarily be an angry person, but you would have certain tendencies, like walking into a room and noticing what's wrong rather
Mm.
than what's beautiful, or you just notice the burn hole in the carpet, for example. But the jewel within that is that sometimes everyone else is studiously avoiding mentioning the burn hole in the carpet. And it's the person with that tendency that'll say, look at that. And everyone else would rather not, but it's very important that we do. And so in some ways we rely on people like that, the truth tellers who will speak of what's wrong, doesn't seem right. But you don't want to be like enmeshed in that forever either, that you can't appreciate the beauty or what else is happening in the room. I personally am a deluded type. There are three types: angry, grasping, or greedy, angry, and deluded. And they're not nice names, but it doesn't mean you're a greedy person again. But the greedy person is the kind of person who will walk into a room and pretty well notice what's beautiful and not really want to look that much at the burn hole in the carpet. And we need them too, for like, it'll all work. Don't worry. And I'm more the deluded type, very much so, which is kind of just sleepy and doesn't notice much, just sort of spaced out and happy, mellow. But the problem with that state, and there are many, but one big problem is that you're then relying on someone else to sort of say what's cooking in the room, you're just sort of there. And the jewel within is a kind of equanimity or balance that if you can combine with noticing rather than not noticing, it's a sort of evenness of temperament.
Yeah, and in the Tibetan tradition with the anger one, they generally expand it to 5. The anger they also say is associated with science and that the ability to be really precise in cutting. And then part of the downside is you could be too rigid and narrow and like block out the fuller range of information that we can take in.
So I propose that Tricycle has a course on personality types.
I
Just
think
throwing
that,
that in the hopper.
yeah, I think that would do very well. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, my teacher, Lama Sultama Leone, she's written a lot about this, but one book is called Wisdom Rising, where she talks about these 5 personality types. And yeah, so I don't know if you're interested in it from the Tibetan tradition, that's a really accessible entry.
Great, thank you. We may revisit that in the Q&A actually. But so now that we've talked a little bit about kind of accepting our tendencies and habits, working with them. Sharon, in the book, you also talk about kind of living in alignment with our values, but it does feel like if a value is something that, I don't know, that we choose, but we may be kind of blocked by our tendencies, whether we're deluded or, or otherwise. How do we overcome, and how do we kind of get in touch with our values so that we can live in accordance with them?
I think we can get in touch with our values by examining them. You can do it journaling, you can do it in conversation, you can do it just reflecting. And I did a lot of that reevaluation sort of in the beginning of lockdown, where all my expectations about where I was going to be and how I was going to be teaching and how I was going to be manifesting and the people I was going to be with, and it was shifted. I came up here to Barry, Mass from New York City thinking I'd be here for 2 weeks. So I came up in March with my snow boots, and then still here a long time later. And the overriding question for me in my own reflection was, what's still true? And one of the translations I'm told of the word dharma, which we tend to translate as the Buddhist teaching or the nature of things, the way of things. One of the translations is that which supports us, or that which sustains us. So it's what we can rely on. So I say, what can I rely on? And I really, really looked. And what's more important to me than anything? And I saw my practice and how much it was giving me, my meditation practice. And I kept coming back to this very difficult but interesting statement from the Buddha, which was echoed, of course, many years later by Martin Luther King Jr., where the Buddha said, hatred will never cease by hatred. Hatred will only cease by love. This is an eternal law. Hatred will never cease by hatred. Hatred will only cease by love. This is an eternal law. And I was always taken with this statement because I think of the Buddha as like Mr. Impermanence. And here he is saying, that's an eternal law? Like, what's that? And it's difficult. Of course, there's many a situation where someone is being kind of hateful and you think, here? Like, really? But every time I ponder it, I don't come up with another variation that's true. It seems true to me. So that has a lot of implications. So we need to kind of feel it out. And that doesn't mean it's rigid or inflexible, but right now, what's my North Star? And then I think part of it, the path is being grateful for and delighting in the little ways we can manifest it. One phone conversation or something I began doing during that period of time was rereading emails before pressing send. Where's the kindness in this, or is this the kind of message that can be misinterpreted? And the little ways we can bring it to life. And realizing that we can approach the patterns we have in a different way, but that too is like moment by moment, because we're used to maybe being ashamed of things we feel, or not liking much that we feel, or avoiding what we're feeling, and so it's just like, okay, little baby step. What's it like to be with it? And speaking of Sultra Maliani, Megan can talk about her kind of feeding the demons approach, which is basically what I'm saying, in a particular way.
Yeah, so I'll just explain that, although I don't feel really qualified to explain it because I'm just starting to explore it. But basically, the idea is that whatever appears as a difficulty or an obstacle within our life or our path, that you actually turn towards it and, like a mother, seek to nurture it with love. Essentially, it's a giving of love, which is really, that's what we're after all the time, right? Like whenever something feels like it's not quite right, like often just love and attention and compassion is the thing that's not being met, that then manifests as some not quite rightness. So that's that's at the crux of feeding your demons. Yeah, Sharon, when you talked about in the pandemic leaning into your practice and the way that was nourishing you, it's, to me, that brings up like getting quiet and listening, which seems often / always maybe to be the answer, and yet it's so hard, especially like during the pandemic. Like that, accessing that kind of quiet for me was really difficult because I felt so unstable. But then I just had to like lean into and feel the feelings of instability. And it's like whatever's manifesting, if you listen and lean into that, then the values or whatever it is seem to like flower forth from it. You don't have to like go around it, although it's really hard, I think, at least for me, to do that leaning in and listening.
I was going to ask you about your pandemic experience and what challenges came to light, or what values you kind of got in touch with. So now that we're in a different phase, I don't really know what to call it, but where maybe life isn't as isolated and quiet. Megan, how do you have the same kind of trouble leaning in and being with being with everything, or what's the experience like now?
No, not at all. Actually, so I would like to talk about my pandemic experience. I never have gotten to voice that. So prior, I was in New York City most of the time, and then I was coming up. I have a little retreat cabin in the Hudson Valley, and I would come up for a few days a week. And then, similar to Sharon, my partner and I came up to this little retreat house thinking it would just be for 2 weeks, and then stayed. And it was the first time I ever really landed here in the country for an extended period of time. And after the initial like obsession with like, refreshing my phone every 3 minutes to see if there was some information available, I just settled into the rhythm of being in the country with the sky and the river and the mountains. And my nervous system really changed versus being in the city all the time and going back and forth. And slowly with that, my practice became much deeper and slower, and it felt very organic and natural. And so many of the places that I used to teach at, where I used to have my office in New York City, everything closed and they haven't reopened yet. And a lot of my teaching is still on Zoom, for better or for worse, but it's enabled me to continue to be up in this retreat cabin a lot of the time, most of the time. And yeah, my practice is totally different. And I feel just tremendous gratitude for that shift and that possibility. And it's funny because there's so much suffering, right? And there's still so much suffering with the pandemic. And yet something really beautiful also came out of it.
Sharon, please interrupt if you had something to add. But that tension is, and being able to acknowledge it and hold it. It is, I don't know, silver lining, however you want to put it. I think, though, kind of something that you're hitting on is probably pretty relevant for everybody. How do we kind of hold these calmer moments in this day and age when we're just constantly being our attention is constantly being pulled. We can't really do anything these days without someone, some device, something. What's like a practical recommendation you have for people to kind of overcome that?
I want to toss this to Sharon.
Okay.
Okay. When people I've studied with will describe meditation practice or mindfulness practice or something like that, they tend to divide it into two categories at least, you know. One would be a formal dedicated period of meditation. You're doing sitting meditation, you're doing walking meditation, the posture doesn't really matter. But your intention in that period of time, for that period of time, is a deepening of qualities like awareness and compassion and so on. You're not sitting down to also work out your strategic plan. Oh, that may come up, you know. It's kind of not the purpose. So that's like the formal dedicated period. And then there are what some teachers call short moments many times. Maybe the most famous example would be, in terms of our lives, would be Thich Nhat Hanh, who said, don't pick up your phone on the first ring. Let it ring 3 times and breathe. Then you pick it up. And I thought I once used that example. I was teaching in a financial firm in New York, and I suggested that, and I looked up and I saw the complete panic on everyone's faces. And I said, maybe just twice, just let it ring twice for you. 2 or 3 times. And don't always be multitasking. Sometimes just drink the cup of tea. Not while you're checking your email, not while you're on Zoom, but just drink the cup of tea. Feel the warmth of the teacup. Smell the tea, taste the tea. Short moments. It's not going to completely undo your to-do list or be this unbearable burden, but it's very impactful. And I find, you know, that it needs to be intentional. Basically, you have to build it into your day. People I know who work in the corporate world tell me they have to put it on their calendar. You know, like for 2 minutes before this big meeting or this big Zoom or phone call, I'm just going to be. I'm going to simply be. Or build it around events like a meal or a cup of tea, something like that. It doesn't necessarily just happen. And so building it in is important. And for me, I will say also that dedicated period is a strong part of that. You know, I know the theory, you know, that you can be mindful anytime. You don't have to have a practice that's sort of more dedicated that way. And it's obviously true. But will I actually breathe for 3 counts of that ring? No. And I'm much more likely to if I've also practiced that day formally. And what's amazing is that, you know, what neuroscience is saying is that it doesn't have to be like a long period of practice either. You know, Amishi Jha is one example of a neuroscientist studying meditation, says 12 minutes a day. And I, because she's a friend and, you know, we've known each other for many years, I usually say to her, I don't know that it's that healthy to go for the bare minimum, you know, like maybe you can extend that and it would be different, but just think of that, you know, just 12 minutes a day can have a difference in your life.
You know, as you're talking, Sharon, I realized that I have these things that I do when I feel like I'm having difficulty, when life has gotten too busy. And my 2 main ones, one is to take a walk. And there's just something about walking, I mean, ideally in nature, but even just around the city, that I guess it's like a combination of the energies moving, but it's also calming. So doing that, I'll do that when I have difficulty getting quiet. And then very often after a long walk, I can go into a quieter practice. And then the other one is kind of like embarrassing to share, but I'll just share it because it's very effective. If I'm really having a hard time settling, I go get a massage. And even just like a 30-minute foot massage, and in New York City, right, you can get a 30-minute foot massage kind of everywhere. It breaks like whatever the tension or the resistance that's happening in my body and psyche in a way that's really effective. So I do recommend that people find their kind of, it's like a liminal practice that will get you to practice when life's gotten too hectic and busy. And they're going to be different for everyone, of course. Those are just my go-tos.
I like, I always find that it's very helpful to hear from two teachers what their strategies are day to day. So thank you. I can't believe we only have about 15 minutes left. So before we kind of transition to the next phase of this conversation, Sharon or Megan, is there anything else that you kind of want to hit on when it comes to kind of moving from, moving towards freedom and moving towards our realizing our full potential that we haven't really hit on yet?
Well, we've hit on it, but I guess I'll just repeat, what was, the emphasis I tried to put in the book, and which will be in the course, is that kind of different way for many of us of relating to contracted states, so we're not adding shame and fear and dislike and all that. And it was interesting to me because there are a variety of options I present. You could just talk about mindfulness, because mindfulness actually covers that, or there are techniques in mindfulness like RAIN, RAIN, to recognize, accept or acknowledge, investigate, and not identify. I talk about that a few times. I talk about this technique from my Tibetan teacher, Sonny Rinpoche. She calls handshake practice, which is really basically the same. It's like invite that force into dinner, like keep an eye on them. Don't let them have the run of the house, but you don't have to be so afraid. Like, in truth, your awareness is strong enough to handle all of these things that may arise. And, as I began doing interviews for the book, the thing that everyone brought up, every journalist, was handshake practice. That somehow that way of expressing it was very meaningful to people. But there are many ways of expressing it. It's just that shift, which is so different for us, to actually have a kind of loving kindness for ourselves, no matter what we're feeling, and to experiment with the power of awareness.
One of the things that I really appreciated about your book, Sharon, and I feel like it makes it like a book very much of the moment, is how you draw on so many different disciplines. So it's mindfulness and neuroscience and somatic experiences, and I don't know, the whole gamut. And I think, to me, that is what's really exciting about the time that we're living in. Like, we're not just, the tools that we have to open up, to move out of this constricted state, seem more expansive to me than ever. And everybody's talking, and we're not so like scared to expand our lane. Yeah, I find it exciting.
That's such a nice point. And maybe a good place to pause, actually. Yeah. So I think we will have time for some questions. But before we move into that, I'm going to turn it over to Sharon now for kind of a short meditation to close this portion out, and give you all a little bit of time to think if there's anything else you want to ask Megan or Sharon.
Thank you. Yeah, I would love to just close this portion out as we've heard, just with a very short sitting, because just as beginning an experience with that kind of quiet moment, ending it also allows us to absorb more fully. So you can sit comfortably, close your eyes or not, however you feel most at ease. Just feel the energy that's happening in your body, whatever it might be. See if you can feel the earth supporting you. See if you can feel space touching you. Usually we think of touching space, we think of picking up a finger and poking it in the air, but space is always touching us. It's already touching us. You just need to feel it. Notice your emotional landscape, whatever it might be, happy, sad, sleepy, joyous. As much as possible without judgment. It simply is. And feel your breath. Wherever the breath is strongest for you or clearest for you, the nostrils, the chest, or the abdomen, you can find that place, bring your attention there, and just rest. So thank you.
Your voice was so sweet when you said thank you.
Mhm.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you both. We do have some time for questions, so I'm going to just jump right in. One person did ask about that course on personality. So just for clarification, that was a great suggestion by Sharon that maybe we'll think about, but that is not a current course in Tricycle's library. But maybe one day. But yes, Sharon's course, Real Life, will be launching November 13th. For all of you here, you can use the code RealLife25 when you register to get 25% off. And all of this information is on Tricycle's website. So let's go to another question. Let's see. Here's a nice one. If you haven't already covered this, which I don't think we did, since this talk overlaps with Sukkot, I'd love to hear from Sharon any overlap between Judaism and Tibetan Buddhism about this time in the cycle. Namaste and shalom. And for anyone who doesn't know, Sukkot is a holiday happening right now in the Jewish year.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a holiday that commemorates the 40 years of wandering in the desert before freedom. And so what it reminds me of, because of course, any body of inspiration or knowledge has a lot to be explored. What it reminds me of is actually the value of the wandering. It's like not being fixated on the goal, although of course we want to accomplish the goal. That's why we get up a little earlier in the morning, or we take the time not to pick up our phone on the first ring. We have an adventure in trying to be different, but we don't need to get fixated on the goal, because every step of the journey is of value and interest too. There's this great kind of folk saying in Asia where the hunter goes into the forest to capture a bird, but in the end, it matters not so very much whether they capture the bird or not, because all along they're learning the ways of the forest. It's like we're learning the nature of the body and the mind and life and love and the opposite states as well. And that's our journey, and it's truly something to have respect for and to pay attention to. So that was the equivalent sort of thing that came up in my mind.
Oh, I just love that. So another question, Megan, can you talk a little bit more about getting quiet and listening to what? Maybe could you share a practical example from your life when you listened, heard, and acted? And then there's a parenthesis and says, and the questioner says, can you tell I'm a consultant?
Sure, yeah. I mean, we all know what it is to get quiet and to listen. And we all know that that can be difficult, as we've talked about. But I think a key there is not to have something in mind in terms of listening to what. I think it's dropping that expectation and listening and sort of opening to what is. And what is going to be different for each person in each moment, like that. And I don't know how useful it is really to share an example of me getting quiet and listening and what I found, but rather more to just keep putting it back on each of us. Can we, because that's what we have to do, right? We each have to do it ourselves and experience it. And you're not going to know how to do it or what's going to be there until you do it. You just got to do it and go through the messiness along the way.
Thank you. Somebody also asked, let's see, it sounds like the practice is the most important thing we can do in our lives. How does learning about Buddhist concepts like the Bardo or the Eightfold Path compare to mindfulness or practice? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to try to be really brief so that I can hear from Megan too, because we're coming from somewhat different lineages and in terms of our own training. But I don't want to disparage that kind of learning. I think it's really helpful. It helps us open our ideas and our perspective, but putting it into practice, whatever we're putting into practice, seems to me a different thing than a kind of intellectual appreciation. And so mindfulness for me was a very direct and almost like simple to understand. And so it was a very useful tool for me. Since I'd never, done any kind of introspection before, really. I was 18. And it remains, a very direct way. It's one thing to, as I can, give you a theoretical understanding of the Bardo, and it's another thing to face change in my life and uncertainty. And so what am I going to pull upon when I'm struggling? It's going to be the practice.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, I love learning, and I highly encourage everyone to go learn all the Buddhist philosophy and ins and outs. But when it comes down to it, it's experiencing it firsthand and exploring it and all of that vulnerability and excitement and possibility that comes with it.
Well, thank you. I'm going to throw one more question that's going to just kind of open up a huge can of worms that we don't have time for, but it's a fun question. So, and it ties back to the topic at hand. So how do we know if we are utilizing our full potential? And I'll leave it there.
I think if I was going to describe myself in one word at the age of 18, before I began practice, it would be fragmented. And what I yearned for was not to feel so fragmented, to feel a sense of wholeness. And I think, I don't know about full potential, in the ultra absolute sense, but we can feel the difference, when we have that more of a sense of wholeness, and every part of ourselves is present in a different way. Even if it's fleeting, it's very different.
I like to think there's a full potential. I like to think, because that's how I think of enlightenment. I don't know yet, but I do like to think that way. And I hear its flavor is openness and freedom and love. So I think the degree to which we are embodying that and experiencing that might be a little bit of a clue.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Sharon and Megan. It's been a pleasure, and I hope that if anyone has questions, you know where to find us, and we'll look out for that personality class on Tricycle. But truly, this has been wonderful, and thank you all for coming and for your thoughtful questions. Keep joining us for more virtual events.